If you suspect or have been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, did the investigation stop as soon as you got the label? The label names what you're experiencing, but it doesn't explain the terrain that produced it. And that's exactly where the standard approach runs out of runway. I'm Dr. Kenny, an IFM certified functional medicine practitioner, and sorting through this gap is a big part of what I do every day in practice. In this video, I'm walking you through what the diagnosis is not telling you about the systems that drove your threshold low enough for fibromyalgia, the label, to land all at once. Here's an image that I use with patients that often clicks a little faster than any clinical explanation I've ever tried. Imagine this expression, the straw that breaks the camel's back. You can stack things on top of a camel to travel long distances across the desert. Each one of the pieces of straw represents a stressor, one that we just add on top of another, on top of another. The body has a fascinating ability to adapt until it doesn't. So whether your sleep is suffering, there's hidden gut symptoms, or you push through a period of high demand and mostly recover, or maybe a little viral illness here or there. Each one of these you recover from, and then one day you add something on that should have been manageable, and the whole structure, or the camel's back, gives away. When it comes to fibromyalgia and other conditions where we talk about loss of tolerance, the straw itself isn't the problem, that one life-changing event, but what was already stacked upon the furniture day in and day out across a lifetime. Fibromyalgia is an example of a diagnosis of what it looks like when that weight limit is reached. And the diagnosis on its own doesn't really tell you anything about what's been stacking over time. Here's what some of the research has established. Your brain and your spinal cord have pain processing circuits. And in fibromyalgia, those circuits become dysregulated. They start amplifying signals that a normal, healthy nervous system would regularly filter out. Research calls this central sensitization. What that means for people with or suspecting fibromyalgia is that the pain is real and it's neurological, but the origin is not damage to your muscles or joints. It's a system, especially a nervous system, that has lost its ability to modulate the volume of the pain signal. And that amplification travels with other issues like fatigue, memory problems and brain fog, and sleep disruption. And that's not a coincidence because these share the same dysregulated circuitry. So if you finally received a fibromyalgia diagnosis without explaining this underneath, they gave you a label for what your systems were showing while the underlying mechanisms remained unnamed. Many of my patients finally reach me at this point with their diagnosis sack of potatoes without understanding why. And by the way, the research summary with all the sources that I pulled together for this video is in the description in the pinned comment below. Check it out. It's readable, not too technical, but includes the research articles linked to it as well. So I encourage you to check it out. Here's the thing about central sensitization as an explanation. It also names the end state. It does not explain what drove the regulatory threshold low enough for that amplification of the pain to become chronic and self-perpetuating. And that's a question your management plan is probably not answering at the same time as well. The way this looks in many experiences of patients with fibromyalgia is that they have other diagnoses alongside that singular one. Think of it this way. You can imagine that there's a single pressure source that's far upstream and it's hidden, and it feeds into multiple downstream gauges, things like pain levels, fatigue levels, depression and anxiety or sleep quality, even gut health issues, for instance. All of these gauges are reading critically high at the same time. But the problem with the standard clinical approach is they're looking at each gauge individually, thus subspecialties in conventional medicine, a medicine for the pain, an antibiotic for the gut issue, and maybe an antidepressant and a sleep aid for the cognitive disturbances. But the pressure source itself has not been addressed or changed. And this is why treating fibromyalgia symptom by symptom tends to produce results that are partial or temporary or 30 to 50% at best. The treatments are often reasonable based on the line of questioning that's asking about your symptoms alone. They are just addressed to the output, not what's generating the pressure further upstream. And the honest clinical observation that I see from patients in practice is that those outputs are not separate problems that are just running in isolated parallels. They are a single terrain, a single story, a single sum of a patient's lived experiences that can often explain what's going on to lead to that loss of tolerance. So when I use the word terrain, what are we talking about that's actually depleted or overworked? A 2025 review found that fibromyalgia is associated with dysregulation across several interconnected systems. Number one, the stress response system and cortisol that governs it. Number two is the balance of the autonomic nervous system, or the part of the nervous system that we don't have conscious control over. Next is inflammation of the nervous system. And number four is changes in the microbiome. And finally, number five, disruptions in mitochondrial function. And oftentimes, none of these are operating in isolation. Again, they are deeply connected. What this tells us clinically is that the threshold problem is not coming from just one broken switch in these systems. It's coming from a terrain, an environment, both external and internal, where multiple regulatory systems have been quietly depleted until the whole network has lost its capacity to return to baseline. In my experience, the patients who arrive in my office with a fibromyalgia diagnosis almost always have a recognizable history when you can trace it backwards into their lived experiences. The stress response system's being pushed harder for a sustained period, or we're talking about grade 1, 2, or 3 HPA axis dysfunction, or quote unquote adrenal fatigue. Sometimes things like chronic psychological stress, work-related stress, family drama or trauma, and sometimes an infectious trigger. It's all of these different areas without adequate recovery that are adding to the straw on the camel's back. Almost always, none of these arrived all at the same time, but were rather picked up from different stages of life and accumulated over time. And at some point, the cumulative load crossed a threshold that the system could not recover from. The system being the body-mind experience of the cumulative load, or the pieces of straw that have added up over time. That's the phenomenon of the stacking of the straw on the camel's back. And that's what a diagnosis often doesn't explain. Here's what matters about this framing as well, and it's why it's different from simply saying your nervous system is sensitized and leaving it there. A reservoir that has been depleted can be read. The trajectory that dropped the level is traceable and something we can find objective data to gain some validation and some insight into. And if the trajectory is traceable, it's addressable. I always say to my patients, when you can define something, you can start to deal with something, not by adding something targeted downstream at the symptoms themselves, but by asking what was being spent faster in terms of. And the difference is we're not adding something that's targeted at the downstream symptoms. Rather, we're asking what's going on in the function underneath that has created those symptoms over a period of time. In practice, this is one of the most validating steps of my patients going through chronic health experiences. And this is where the objective data becomes so much more than just a lab printout. When I can look at patterns in someone's gut and microbiome function, or stress chemistry, or advanced hormone processing, or even detoxification pathways, and those patterns directly match what a patient has been experiencing, that's the moment where the chemistry starts to explain the symptoms rather than just coexist and hide underneath them. The same underlying drivers feed multiple symptoms as well. And once you start to see that, the quality of the fibromyalgia picture starts to look a lot less random and more like a system that is giving you multiple readings from one source. And to be precise, this is not the same as saying that we're looking for the panacea or the one thing, the single hidden root cause just waiting to be found that explains all of fibromyalgia and chronic complex health issues. That framing, the search for one thing, is understandable. It's human nature to want the singular explanation. But fibromyalgia and many of the chronic health conditions that I treat in practice as a terrain problem is genuinely multi-axis. The honesty is in the complexity. Holding that without reducing it to a simpler story, like just blaming it on mold or heavy metals, is where the work starts to get honest and it starts to get more productive. And the other side to this conversation is this is also why approved medications or single this for that supplementation often falls short. And this is where many, both doctors and holistic practitioners, often work from. And this is validated by the research outcomes themselves as being described as frequently inadequate. The evidence base for mechanism-targeted approaches is promising, but it's still being built and in the early stages of understanding. So if you experience even partial relief from a conventional or a holistic intervention, just realize that it's probably because of the complexity of this multi-systems experience that is fibromyalgia going on underneath. When I'm working with a patient who's reached this level of depletion or dysregulation, there's a sequence that often matters. And this is where I see the most well-intentioned functional medicine approaches stumble as well. Not because the clinical thinking itself is wrong, but rather the sequence was skipped or the complexity not appreciated. Before anything else, the foundation of safety signals is the most important. Think sleep hygiene or blood sugar stability and movement that doesn't push the system beyond its comfortable threshold. In my clinical experience, some fibromyalgia patients tolerate and benefit from movement. For others, at this point in the terrain conversation, it's just another stressor on a system that it can't absorb. The first question is, which situation are you in? The answer changes what movement should look like based on the person and the individual. That stability layer has to come before deeper interventions that are more moving or additive or detoxifying, because the gut picture or the immune load or the stress response systems are very important. They're often central to healing, but a terrain that is unstable enough to handle that investigation or that pushing or challenging of the system can just push the system further. And I'm curious if you've tried to address this, whether you suspect or have a diagnosis of fibromyalgia, what moved the needle for you even slightly? And what happened when you stop? I ask because these partial responses are often more diagnostically useful and helpful for those going through this exact same story. So drop it in the comments below. I read every one of them. The purpose of this video is for me to help shift the way you think, not necessarily teach you what to think. Conventional medicine didn't get the diagnosis wrong. It's really good at naming and blaming something. Fibromyalgia is a real, defined clinical entity with a very real neurological state and explanation. The amplification of pain signals is genuine and the suffering is genuine. So I hope you hear that with deep validation. When you can name something, when you can define something, you can start to deal with something. What the diagnosis doesn't tell us, and where the line of questioning often stops short, is why the threshold changed to begin with, and how can we support the system that is miscalibrated, if you will. And without that, the management plan is aimed at the signal rather than the terrain generating the signal, which is why the signal keeps returning, or often the trajectory is that the situation gets worse. Our bodies are responding predictably to conditions that outpace its capacity to return to baseline, especially in contemporary society where we are just pushed beyond our limits in so many ways. And objectively, at the chemical level, maybe not the perceived level, because there's also social, political, and other emotional components to it. And that distinction matters enormously for what the next clinical step looks like for many people. If you're in one of the states that I practice in and this is resonating with you, and if you've hit that same threshold repeatedly without a clear explanation for why, the next step is to watch a free training that prepares you to book a health mystery map call where we can see if my type of investigation matches the line of questioning that your case deserves next. So check it out. It's in the description below. And the next question that naturally follows from everything that we've covered today is what drives the terrain and the environment most powerfully. The stress response system and mitochondrial function are two themes that we didn't get in as much today, but are well-documented contributors when it comes to fibromyalgia. And understanding how the nervous system's stress response architecture actually gets pushed into this state of dysregulation is where the shift of understanding often lives. So check out the video. It's right over here, ready for you. I'm Dr. Kenny, Root Cause Health Detective. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.